I want to start with a truth that many people spend years avoiding, a truth that sits quietly in the background of countless relationships, ignored, dismissed, and rationalized away. The people who receive the most from you are not always the people who value you the most. That realization is often shocking, especially for empaths, because it challenges everything they have believed about love, connection, and the nature of giving. For years, they become the person everyone can rely on, the listener, the helper, the peacemaker, the one who stays calm when others lose control, the one who gives second chances, then third chances, and sometimes far more than that. They step into conflicts to create harmony. They carry emotional burdens that do not belong to them. They make themselves available at all hours, responding to messages in the middle of the night, dropping everything to help a friend in crisis, sacrificing their own plans to accommodate someone else's emergency. They put other people's needs ahead of their own and convince themselves that this is what kindness looks like, that this is what love demands, that this is what being a good person requires. Yet, beneath that generosity, a quiet exhaustion begins to grow, a fatigue that creeps in slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a tide that rises inch by inch until suddenly the water is up to their neck. Little by little, they start feeling drained, overlooked, and strangely disconnected from themselves. The most surprising part is that many empaths do not notice this happening until they reach a breaking point, a moment when the cumulative weight of all their giving finally becomes too heavy to carry. One day, the energy is gone. The desire to keep fixing, rescuing, and pleasing everyone disappears, not because they have become bitter, not because they no longer care, but because they finally see the cost of living for everyone except themselves. And that is where the real story begins. What happens next is rarely discussed, rarely acknowledged, and rarely understood by those who have never walked this path themselves. Most people talk about empathy as a gift, a beautiful quality that makes the world a better place, but very few talk about what occurs when an empath stops giving unlimited access to their time, emotions, and energy. The reactions can be unexpected, sometimes shocking, and often deeply revealing. Some people become distant, pulling away as soon as the flow of support slows down. Some become uncomfortable, unsettled by the change in the familiar dynamic. Some become angry, resentful that the empath is no longer playing the role they had come to depend on. Relationships that once seemed strong suddenly begin to change, revealing fault lines that were always there but were hidden beneath the surface of the empath's endless giving. Hidden motives rise to the surface, exposed by the shift in the dynamic. Unspoken expectations become visible, no longer concealed by the comfort of the old patterns. Patterns that remained invisible for years can no longer be ignored, because the empath is no longer participating in them. In many cases, the empath discovers that certain connections were never as balanced as they appeared, that the reciprocity they believed existed was largely an illusion maintained by their own effort. This is not just an emotional experience. Psychology shows that people often become accustomed to roles within relationships, settling into familiar patterns of giving and receiving, supporting and being supported, initiating and responding. When one person changes the role they have always played, the entire dynamic is forced to change as well, creating a ripple effect that touches every aspect of the relationship. That shift can reveal truths that were hiding in plain sight all along, truths that the empath was never able to see while they were too busy giving to notice what was really happening. In this video, you will learn why people-pleasing becomes so deeply connected to an empath's identity, how emotional exhaustion develops without warning, why setting boundaries often creates guilt before it creates freedom, and what truly happens when an empath begins seeing relationships through a clearer lens. You will also discover lesser-known psychological patterns that explain why some people resist healthy boundaries, and why others respect them, why certain individuals become threatened by an empath's growth while others celebrate it, and why the reactions of others can tell you more about them than they reveal about you. Most importantly, you will learn how the journey from constant approval seeking to self-respect transforms the way an empath sees both themselves and the world around them, creating a new foundation for every relationship they will ever have. By the end of this video, a lot of behaviors that once seemed confusing may suddenly make perfect sense, and a lot of feelings that once felt inexplicable may finally find their explanation. So, stay with us until the end, because the final insight may completely change the way you understand empathy, relationships, and personal growth. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy deep psychological insights and powerful lessons about human nature, Make sure to subscribe and join us for more videos like this. Let's begin. Before the empath begins to see the truth, there is usually a role they have been playing for so long that they no longer realize it is a role. It feels natural, like second nature, like simply being themselves. It feels normal, a familiar rhythm that has become woven into the fabric of their daily existence. In many cases, it starts early in life, long before they have the language to understand what is happening to them. The empath becomes highly aware of other people's moods, reactions, and emotional states, developing a hypervigilance that allows them to navigate the emotional landscape of their environment with remarkable precision. They notice tension before anyone says a word, sensing the shift in the atmosphere like a change in barometric pressure. They sense disappointment behind a smile, reading the subtle cues that others overlook. They can feel sadness hidden beneath anger, recognizing the vulnerability that lies beneath the protective shell of rage. While other people move through conversations without noticing these subtle signals, the empath absorbs them almost automatically, taking in emotional information the way a sponge absorbs water. Over time, this ability becomes part of their identity, a core aspect of who they believe themselves to be. They learn that helping others creates peace, that their interventions can calm the emotional storms that swirl around them. They learn that understanding others earns appreciation, that their empathy makes them valued and sought after. They learn that being available makes them valuable, that their presence and support are seen as essential. Without realizing it, they slowly step into the position of caretaker, taking on a role that gradually consumes more and more of their emotional resources. Not because anyone officially assigns them that role, but because it seems to happen naturally wherever they go. Friends begin coming to them with problems, trusting them with their deepest struggles. Family members rely on them for emotional support, expecting them to always be the stable one. Partners expect understanding and patience, assuming that the empath will always be there to absorb their frustrations. Coworkers trust them with personal struggles, seeing them as a safe harbor in a sea of workplace stress. The empath becomes the person who listens when everyone else is tired of listening, who stays calm when others become emotional, who offers comfort when situations become difficult. At first, this feels meaningful, a sense of purpose that fills a deep need for connection and significance. It feels like purpose, like they have found their place in the world. There is satisfaction in helping people feel better, a warm glow that comes from easing someone else's pain. There is pride in being dependable, in being the person everyone can count on. There is a sense of importance in being needed, a feeling that they matter because others rely on them. Yet, hidden beneath this pattern is a belief that often goes unnoticed, a quiet assumption that shapes every interaction and every decision. The belief is that their value comes from what they provide to others, that their worth is measured by their usefulness to the people around them. The more they help, the more worthy they feel. The more they give, the more accepted they feel. The more they sacrifice, the more valuable they become. Approval slowly becomes connected to self-worth, creating a link that is difficult to break because it has been reinforced so many times. This connection is rarely obvious. Most empaths would never say that they need approval, that they are seeking validation through their giving. In fact, many believe they are simply being kind, that their generosity is a natural expression of their compassionate nature. But when approval becomes linked to identity, certain behaviors begin to appear, behaviors that reveal the hidden need beneath the surface kindness. The empath becomes uncomfortable disappointing people, feeling a wave of anxiety when they sense that someone is unhappy with them. They become anxious when someone is upset with them, their mind racing to find a way to restore harmony. They feel guilty when they cannot solve a problem, as if their inability to fix things is a personal failure. They feel responsible when relationships become strained, assuming that they must have done something wrong. Their emotional state starts depending on how other people feel about them, rising and falling with the moods of those around them. If everyone is happy, they feel successful, validated, and secure. If someone is angry, they feel like they have failed, as if their worth has been diminished. This creates a cycle that can continue for years, a loop of giving, seeking approval, and feeling temporary relief until the next demand arises. The empath becomes increasingly focused on maintaining harmony because harmony feels connected to safety, acceptance, and worth. Without it, they feel anxious and unsettled, as if something essential is missing. One of the most exhausting parts of this cycle is the hidden habit of managing other people's emotions. Many empaths do this without even realizing it, So ingrained has this pattern become in their daily lives. They constantly monitor conversations for signs of discomfort, scanning the faces and body language of everyone around them for any hint of distress. They adjust their words to avoid upsetting others, carefully choosing their language to minimize the risk of conflict. They soften criticism, wrapping unpleasant truths in layers of kindness to make them more palatable. They hide frustration, swallowing their irritation to keep the peace. They suppress opinions, silencing their own voice to avoid disagreement. They become experts at reading emotional reactions and adjusting their behavior accordingly, developing a chameleon-like ability to adapt to the needs of whoever they are with. While this may appear thoughtful from the outside, a sign of emotional intelligence and sensitivity, it often comes at a tremendous cost. The empath begins carrying emotional responsibilities that were never theirs to carry, taking on burdens that should belong to others. They start believing that it is their job to prevent conflict, reduce tension, and keep everyone comfortable, as if the emotional well-being of everyone around them depends entirely on their efforts. This responsibility gradually grows larger, expanding to include more people and more situations. If a friend is unhappy, the empath feels responsible for cheering them up, as if their friend's happiness is their personal project. If a family member is stressed, the empath feels responsible for fixing the situation, as if they have the power to solve problems that are not theirs. If a partner is upset, the empath feels responsible for restoring peace, as if any discord is a reflection of their failure. They rarely stop to ask whether these responsibilities actually belong to them, whether they have any real power to change the situations they are trying to manage. Instead, they automatically step forward and take them on, driven by an ingrained sense of obligation that has become as automatic as breathing. Over time, pleasing people no longer feels like a choice, something they do because they want to. It starts feeling like an obligation, a duty they cannot escape without feeling guilty. Saying yes becomes easier than saying no, because saying no risks disappointing someone and triggering the anxiety that comes with it. Sacrificing personal needs becomes easier than risking disappointment, because the discomfort of self-denial feels more manageable than the discomfort of conflict. Giving becomes automatic, a reflex that requires no conscious thought. The problem is that every relationship begins adapting to this behavior, molding itself around the empath's endless availability. People become accustomed to the empath's availability, coming to expect that they will always be there when needed. They become accustomed to their patience, assuming that the empath will never lose their temper or reach their limit. They become accustomed to their willingness to help, treating the empath's generosity as a given rather than a gift. What started as generosity slowly becomes expectation, and the shift happens so gradually that no one notices it happening. The empath often does not notice this shift because it happens gradually, over months and years of consistent giving. They continue giving because it feels normal, because it is what they have always done. They continue supporting because it feels right, because helping others gives them a sense of purpose. Yet, each act of self-sacrifice reinforces the belief that their role is to serve the emotional needs of others, tightening the pattern and making it harder to break. As months turn into years, the imbalance becomes more difficult to see, because the empath has become so accustomed to the dynamic that they no longer recognize it as imbalanced. The empath may begin feeling tired, but they tell themselves everyone gets tired, that their exhaustion is just a normal part of life. They may feel unappreciated, but they convince themselves they should not expect anything in return, that true giving is its own reward. They may feel overwhelmed, but they believe helping people is simply part of who they are, that they would not know how to be any different. Instead of questioning the pattern, they push themselves harder, believing that if they just give a little more, things will improve. They become more available, more understanding, more forgiving, more patient, stretching themselves thinner and thinner until there is nothing left to give. Yet every time they ignore their own needs, they move a little further away from themselves, losing touch with their own desires, their own feelings, their own identity. At first, this behavior looks like kindness. It looks compassionate. It looks generous. People often praise it, telling the empath how wonderful they are, how lucky others are to have them. Society often rewards it, celebrating the selfless giver, the one who puts others first. Yet beneath the surface, something dangerous begins to happen, a slow erosion of the empath's sense of self. The empath slowly loses sight of where other people's responsibilities end and their own begin. Their identity becomes so focused on helping others that they struggle to recognize their own needs, desires, and emotions. The line between compassion and self-abandonment becomes blurred, and the empath can no longer tell where healthy caring ends and unhealthy sacrifice begins. This is where the cost begins to emerge, the price that is paid for years of endless giving. Emotional burnout rarely arrives suddenly, like a thunderclap that comes out of nowhere. It develops quietly, like a slow leak that eventually floods the entire basement. The empath wakes up one day feeling slightly more tired than usual, a heaviness that does not lift with rest. Then, a little more exhausted the following week, a deeper fatigue that seems to settle into their bones. Then increasingly drained over the following months, a depletion that affects every aspect of their life. Because they are so accustomed to focusing on others, they often ignore the warning signs, dismissing their exhaustion as something that will pass. They tell themselves they just need rest, a good night's sleep, a quiet weekend. They tell themselves things will improve soon, that this is just a temporary phase. They continue giving despite feeling depleted, pushing through the fatigue because stopping feels impossible. The cycle continues because stopping feels uncomfortable, because they do not know who they are without the role of caretaker. Helping has become part of their identity, so central to their sense of self that they cannot imagine a version of themselves that does not give endlessly. Without it, they are not entirely sure who they are, what they want, or what they need. As emotional exhaustion grows, another feeling begins to appear, a gnawing resentment that surfaces unexpectedly. This can be confusing for empaths because resentment seems to conflict with their caring nature, with their genuine desire to help. They genuinely want to help people, to ease their suffering and bring comfort. They genuinely love the people in their lives, with a depth of feeling that is real and powerful. Yet, deep inside, frustration begins building, a quiet anger that they try to suppress. They notice that they are always the one making sacrifices, the one who gives up their time and energy. They notice that their needs rarely receive the same attention, that their struggles are often overlooked. They notice that support often flows in one direction, from them to others, with nothing coming back in return. Because they dislike conflict, they usually keep these feelings hidden, burying them beneath layers of kindness and patience. They smile, remaining supportive even when they feel drained. They continue giving, even when they have nothing left. Meanwhile, the resentment grows quietly beneath the surface, an underground river that flows unseen until it suddenly breaks through. This hidden resentment creates an internal conflict, a war between two parts of the empath's psyche. Part of the empath wants to continue helping, driven by their genuine compassion and their desire to be a good person. Another part feels increasingly exhausted by the demands placed upon them, resentful of the endless giving that never seems to be reciprocated. They begin feeling trapped between compassion and self-preservation, caught in a no-win situation where every choice feels wrong. Every request for help feels heavier, a burden that they can no longer carry easily. Every emotional burden feels larger, a weight that presses down on their spirit. Every expectation feels more difficult to carry, a load that grows heavier with each passing day. Yet, they continue saying yes because saying no feels selfish, because they have been conditioned to believe that prioritizing themselves is wrong. The guilt associated with prioritizing themselves often feels stronger than the discomfort of self-sacrifice, a powerful force that keeps them trapped in the old patterns. As this pattern continues, personal needs begin disappearing into the background, fading from view until they are almost invisible. Goals are postponed, dreams set aside, ambitions abandoned in favor of meeting the needs of others. Rest is delayed, self-care neglected, boundaries ignored. The empath becomes so focused on supporting others that they rarely invest the same energy into themselves, pouring all their resources into other people's lives while their own lies fallow. They know what everyone else needs, what everyone else feels, what everyone else wants. They can anticipate the needs of others with remarkable accuracy, reading their emotions and responding to their unspoken desires. But when asked what they need or how they feel, they often struggle to answer, as if the question is being asked in a foreign language. Their attention has been directed outward for so long that their connection with themselves begins fading, like a muscle that has not been used in years. The pressure becomes even heavier because many empaths start feeling responsible for everyone's happiness, carrying the weight of expectations that were never theirs to bear. They believe relationships succeed when everyone feels good, that their job is to ensure that everyone around them is content. They believe peace must be maintained at all costs, that any conflict is a sign of failure. They believe conflict means failure, a reflection of their inability to manage the situation properly. This mindset places an impossible burden on their shoulders, a weight that would crush anyone. Human emotions are complex, unpredictable, and often difficult to navigate. People experience disappointment, frustration, sadness, and anger for countless reasons that have nothing to do with the empath. Yet, the empath often acts as though it is their duty to prevent those emotions from occurring, as if they have the power to control how other people feel. The result is constant pressure, an endless emotional labor, a never-ending cycle of managing, soothing, and fixing. Eventually, the empath begins losing connection with their own identity, becoming so skilled at adapting to others that they forget what feels authentic. They know how to be supportive, how to offer comfort and encouragement. They know how to be understanding, how to listen without judgment. They know how to be agreeable, how to avoid conflict and maintain harmony. But they struggle to identify their own preferences without considering everyone else's needs first, unable to separate their own desires from the demands of others. The person who once felt deeply connected to their emotions now feels disconnected from themselves, a stranger in their own body. The role of caretaker has become so dominant that it overshadows everything else, consuming their identity until there is nothing left but the role itself. There comes a point when the emotional cost becomes too high to ignore, a threshold that cannot be crossed without breaking. The exhaustion reaches a level that can no longer be explained away, a fatigue that is bone-deep and unshakable. The resentment becomes impossible to suppress, a constant presence that colors every interaction. The imbalance becomes impossible to justify, no matter how many excuses the empath makes. For some empaths, this realization arrives after a betrayal, a moment when someone they trusted reveals that they never truly valued what was given. For others, it comes after repeated disappointment, a slow accumulation of letdowns that finally reaches a critical mass. Sometimes, it appears during a period of intense stress, when the empath's resources are already depleted and they can no longer cope. Sometimes, it arrives during a quiet moment of reflection, a sudden clarity that cuts through the fog of denial. Regardless of how it happens, the awareness begins growing, expanding, until it can no longer be contained. They start questioning patterns they once accepted without hesitation, examining the assumptions that have guided their lives. The first changes are often small, almost imperceptible adjustments that signal a shift in perspective. The empath stops over-explaining every decision, no longer feeling the need to justify their choices to everyone around them. They stop writing lengthy messages, trying to prevent misunderstandings, trusting that their intentions are clear. They stop spending hours justifying simple choices, recognizing that not everything needs to be defended. They begin recognizing that not every decision requires permission or approval, that they have the right to choose for themselves. This shift may seem minor, a small change in behavior, but it represents a profound change in thinking, a fundamental reorientation of their relationship with the world. For years, they felt responsible for managing how others perceived them, investing enormous energy in controlling the impressions they made. Now, they begin realizing that not every reaction belongs to them, that other people's responses are their own responsibility. Soon, boundaries begin appearing where none existed before, clear lines that define what is acceptable and what is not. The empath starts protecting their time, guarding it like the precious resource it is. They become more selective about where they invest their energy, choosing to give only to what truly matters. They begin recognizing that availability should not be unlimited, that they have the right to say no. These boundaries often feel uncomfortable at first, like wearing shoes that do not quite fit. The empath worries about appearing selfish, about being seen as uncaring. They worry about disappointing people, about letting them down. They worry about damaging relationships, about losing the connections that matter to them. Yet, despite these fears, they continue moving forward because they can no longer ignore the cost of living without boundaries. Then comes the moment many empaths fear most, the first real no. A simple word, a short response, a brief refusal. Yet, emotionally, it can feel enormous, like a mountain that must be climbed. The empath may replay the conversation repeatedly afterward, examining every word. They may question whether they were too harsh, whether they could have been gentler. They may worry about how the other person feels, anxious about their reaction. They may experience guilt almost immediately, a wave of regret that threatens to undo their resolve. Years of conditioning have taught them that saying yes creates acceptance, while saying no creates risk, that agreeing makes them safe and refusing makes them vulnerable. Breaking that pattern is rarely easy, a struggle that requires courage and persistence. The fear of disappointing others becomes especially intense during this stage, a constant companion that whispers doubts in their ear. The empath often assumes that healthy boundaries will push people away, that they will be rejected for asserting their needs. They expect rejection, preparing themselves for the worst. They expect criticism, bracing for the disapproval of others. They expect conflict, anticipating the arguments that will follow. Every step towards self-respect feels accompanied by uncertainty, a fog that makes it difficult to see the path ahead. Yet, something remarkable begins happening. The more they honor their own needs, the more clearly they start seeing the reality of their relationships, the truth that was always there, but was hidden by their own giving. The guilt remains present for a while, a stubborn presence that refuses to leave. In fact, many empaths mistake guilt for evidence that they are doing something wrong, interpreting their discomfort as a sign that they have made a mistake. They assume discomfort means they should return to old behaviors, that the guilt is telling them to go back. But the guilt is often a sign that they are breaking long-established patterns, a signal that they are stepping out of familiar territory. It is the emotional residue of years spent prioritizing everyone else, the echo of old conditioning that is slowly losing its power. As difficult as it feels, the guilt is not the most important part of the transformation. It is a symptom, not the disease. The most surprising part is what happens in other people, the reactions that emerge when the empath's behavior changes. As boundaries become stronger, reactions begin appearing, responses that reveal the true nature of the relationships. Some people become distant, pulling away as the flow of support slows down. Individuals who once contacted the empath constantly suddenly disappear, their calls and messages becoming less frequent. Conversations become less frequent, the easy rhythm of communication replaced by silence. Invitations stop coming, social connections fading into memory. The relationship begins fading, a slow dissolution that leaves the empath wondering what went wrong. At first, this can feel painful, a loss that cuts deep. The empath may wonder what went wrong, whether they are the problem. But slowly they begin noticing a pattern, a consistent thread that runs through these experiences. The distance often appears only after access becomes limited, suggesting that the connection was more about convenience than care. Other people respond with anger, frustrated by limits that never existed before. They question the empath's decisions, challenging their choices. They accuse them of changing, as if growth is a betrayal. They express disappointment, as if the empath owes them something. The empath who once would have rushed to repair the situation starts observing these reactions more carefully, noticing the dynamics that were always there. They begin asking themselves an important question. Why does a healthy boundary create such a strong response? Some individuals become manipulative, using guilt and pressure to regain access. They remind the empath of past favors, attempting to create obligation. They imply selfishness, suggesting that the empath is wrong to prioritize themselves. They attempt to trigger obligation, using emotional leverage to get what they want. These tactics often worked in the past because the empath was highly sensitive to disappointment, because they could not bear to let anyone down. But now the pattern becomes visible, the manipulation exposed by the light of awareness. What once felt like normal interaction starts looking very different, revealing the hidden dynamics that were always present. Others try restoring the old dynamic, pushing against the new boundaries. They test limits repeatedly, seeing how far they can go. They continue making the same demands, acting as though nothing has changed. They act as though nothing has changed, refusing to acknowledge the shift. The empath begins recognizing how invested some people were in the previous version of the relationship, how much they benefited from the old dynamic. Not because they valued the empath as a person, but because they benefited from unlimited access to their time, attention, patience, and emotional support. With each reaction, the truth becomes clearer, the reality of the relationship exposed by the change. The empath starts seeing the difference between respect and dependence, recognizing which relationships are built on genuine care and which are built on convenience. They begin identifying who genuinely cares about their well-being and who primarily cares about maintaining access to what they provide. Relationships that once seemed identical begin revealing important differences, distinctions that were invisible before. Some people adjust respectfully, accepting the new boundaries without resistance. Some people become supportive, encouraging the empath's growth. Some people appreciate the healthier dynamic, recognizing its value. Others resist every step of the change, fighting to maintain the old patterns. The deeper the empath looks, the more visible these patterns become, the more the truth reveals itself. They realize that healthy relationships do not collapse because of reasonable boundaries. Healthy relationships adapt, growing to accommodate the needs of both people. Healthy relationships respect limits, honoring the autonomy of each person. Healthy relationships allow both people to have needs, recognizing that everyone deserves care. What boundaries often destroy are unhealthy expectations, the assumptions that kept the old dynamic functioning. What boundaries often expose are imbalances that existed long before anyone acknowledged them, imbalances that were hidden beneath the surface of the relationship. And as this realization settles in, the empath begins seeing people, relationships, and themselves with a level of clarity they have never experienced before, a clarity that is both painful and liberating. For many empaths, the deepest shock does not come from setting boundaries. It does not come from saying no. It does not even come from watching certain people become distant, from witnessing the fading of relationships that once seemed secure. The real shock arrives when they begin looking back and noticing patterns that were present all along, patterns that were invisible to them at the time but are now unmistakable. For years, they believed many of their relationships were built on deep emotional connection, on mutual care and respect. They believed loyalty, care, and understanding were flowing in both directions, creating a balanced exchange of support. They believed the people around them valued them for who they were, for their character and their heart. But after stepping out of the role of constant giver, a different picture begins to emerge, a picture that challenges everything they thought they knew. Slowly, they start recognizing that some relationships were built less on connection and more on access. Access to their time, access to their energy, access to their patience, access to their emotional support. As long as that access remained unlimited, everything seemed stable, the relationship functioning smoothly. Everything seemed healthy, with no obvious signs of trouble. Everything seemed secure, a reliable source of connection. But once limits appeared, once the empath began to protect their boundaries, the foundation of certain relationships began revealing itself, exposing the truth that had always been there. This realization is difficult because it forces the empath to re-examine experiences they once interpreted differently, to see their past through a new lens. Conversations that seemed harmless now look different, revealing hidden agendas and unspoken expectations. Interactions that once felt normal begin revealing hidden expectations, expectations that were never expressed but were always present. They start noticing how often they were the one initiating contact, how often they were the one checking in, how often they were the one offering support without receiving the same level of care in return. They begin noticing how some people only appeared during moments when they needed something: advice, comfort, attention, validation, emotional labor. The empath starts connecting dots that remained scattered for years, seeing the patterns that were always there. Each realization adds another piece to the puzzle, another layer of understanding. The more awareness grows, the more repeated patterns become impossible to ignore, the more the truth refuses to be denied. Different people, different situations, different relationships, yet somehow the same dynamic keeps appearing, a consistent pattern of giving and taking. The empath gives, others receive. The empath sacrifices, others benefit. The empath adjusts, others remain comfortable. What once looked like isolated incidents begins forming a larger pattern, a recurring theme that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. This can be both painful and enlightening, a mix of grief and clarity. Painful because it reveals how much energy was invested in relationships that lacked balance, how many years were spent giving to people who never truly gave back. Enlightening because it finally explains feelings that never fully made sense before, the vague sense of unease that was always there but could never be named. One of the biggest shifts occurs when the empath stops confusing need with love, a confusion that is more common than many people realize. When someone constantly depends on an empath, it can feel like love, a sign of closeness and connection. When someone frequently seeks their advice, comfort, or support, it can feel like closeness, evidence of a deep bond. When someone cannot function without their presence, it can feel like importance, proof that they matter. But dependence and love are not the same thing. Need and love are not the same thing. A person can need what you provide without truly valuing who you are, appreciating your services more than your soul. A person can depend on your support without respecting your well-being, taking your care for granted without ever considering your needs. This distinction becomes clearer as boundaries begin separating genuine connection from emotional dependency, as the empath learns to see the difference. The empath also starts questioning another belief they carried for years, the belief that sacrifice automatically creates loyalty. For a long time, they assumed that giving more would strengthen relationships, that their generosity would be rewarded with commitment and care. They assumed that enduring discomfort for others would be appreciated, that their suffering would be recognized and valued. They assumed that loyalty meant continuing to give regardless of personal cost, that true commitment meant never giving up. Yet experience begins teaching a different lesson, a lesson that is hard to learn but impossible to forget. Sacrifice alone does not guarantee respect. Sacrifice alone does not create healthy relationships. In some situations, excessive sacrifice simply teaches people to expect more, to demand more, to take more without ever giving back. The empath begins realizing that loyalty without boundaries can become self-abandonment disguised as virtue, a form of giving that slowly destroys the giver. As these insights deepen, another realization emerges, a truth that cuts to the heart of the empath's identity. Being useful is not the same as being valued. This truth often strikes with tremendous force, because many empaths have spent years connecting usefulness with worth, measuring their value by what they can provide. They became the helper, the problem solver, the supporter, the emotional anchor for everyone around them. Their value felt connected to what they contributed, to the support they offered. But genuine value extends beyond usefulness, beyond the services we provide. True connection remains present even when a person cannot give endlessly, remaining strong even when the giving stops. True respect survives boundaries, existing independent of what a person can provide. True care does not disappear the moment access becomes limited, remaining constant even when the flow of support slows. Understanding this difference changes how the empath views nearly every relationship in their life, revealing the true nature of each connection. The emotional impact of these discoveries can be overwhelming, a flood of feeling that cannot be contained. There may be sadness, a grief for the years that were lost. There may be disappointment, a recognition of how much was given for so little in return. There may even be grief, a mourning for the loss of illusions. Not necessarily grief over losing people, though that may be part of it, but grief over losing illusions, the comforting beliefs that sustained them for so long. The empath mourns the version of reality they once believed in, the story they told themselves about their relationships. They mourn assumptions that felt comforting, the belief that they were loved for who they were. They mourn the belief that effort always creates reciprocity, that giving enough would eventually be rewarded. Yet despite the pain, a new kind of freedom begins emerging, a liberation that is both terrifying and exhilarating. Freedom from constantly chasing approval, from the endless need for validation. Freedom from endless emotional obligations, from the weight of responsibilities that were never theirs. Freedom from relationships built on imbalance, from giving without receiving. Freedom from carrying responsibilities that never truly belonged to them, from the burden of carrying everyone else's emotions. This realization hurts, but it also creates freedom, a space for something new to grow. Yet, freedom does not always feel empowering in the beginning. In fact, one of the most difficult stages often comes immediately afterward, a period of disorientation and uncertainty. The empath enters a strange period that feels unfamiliar and uncertain, a transition zone between the old and the new. A period where old patterns no longer fit, but new patterns have not fully formed, leaving the empath in a state of limbo. A period where clarity exists, but confidence is still developing, where the mind understands, but the heart has not yet caught up. This is the lonely middle stage, a challenging phase that tests the empath's resolve. The loneliness can be surprising, an unexpected visitor that arrives without warning. After all, the empath may still be surrounded by people. Friends may still exist, familiar faces that have been part of their life for years. Family members may still be present, the connections of blood and history. Conversations may still happen, interactions that fill the hours of the day. Yet, internally, everything feels different, as if the world has shifted on its axis. The familiar role that once defined their interactions has changed, no longer available to them. They are no longer automatically available, no longer the first person everyone calls. They are no longer constantly managing everyone's emotions, no longer the emotional regulator for every situation. They are no longer sacrificing themselves to maintain harmony, no longer giving away their peace to keep others comfortable. Because of this, relationships begin feeling unfamiliar, as if they are meeting people for the first time. The empath feels as though they are learning how to exist in a completely different way, navigating a world that no longer fits the old patterns. During this stage, isolation often appears, a quiet presence that settles over their life. Not because the empath wants to be alone, but because they are no longer participating in old dynamics. Some relationships naturally fade, their foundation too weak to survive the change. Some connections weaken, the old intimacy replaced by a new distance. Some people drift away, their departure a silent commentary on the nature of the relationship. The absence created by these changes can feel unsettling, a void where connection used to be. There may be moments when silence feels louder than noise, a heavy quiet that echoes through the emptiness. Moments when the empath wonders whether they made the right decision, whether they have ruined something valuable. Moments when they question whether maintaining boundaries was worth the cost, whether the price of peace was too high. This questioning is normal, a natural part of the transition. Human beings naturally seek familiarity, preferring the known to the unknown. Even unhealthy patterns can feel comforting simply because they are familiar, providing a sense of security that is difficult to give up. The empath may find themselves missing relationships that caused stress, longing for connections that were more draining than nourishing, missing people who rarely reciprocated, whose presence in their life was never truly mutual, missing dynamics that left them exhausted, the familiar rhythm of giving and receiving that they knew so well. This confusion often occurs because they are not only losing relationships, they are losing routines, expectations, and identities that existed for years, the familiar structures that gave their life meaning. What they miss is not always the person, but the predictability, the certainty of knowing what to expect. There are days when doubt becomes particularly strong, when the empath's resolve is tested. The empath remembers positive memories, the good moments that made the relationship feel worthwhile. They focus on moments of connection, the times when they felt seen and understood. They wonder whether they were too strict, too distant, too firm, whether they could have handled things differently. They replay conversations repeatedly, analyzing every word and gesture. They question boundaries that were actually reasonable, second-guessing decisions that were right for them. Old conditioning continues whispering familiar messages, the voices of the past echoing in their mind. Maybe you should have done more. Maybe you should have been more understanding. Maybe you should have sacrificed a little longer. These thoughts can be difficult to resist because they echo beliefs that shaped much of their life, the core assumptions that guided their decisions. At the same time, the empath begins learning a skill they may have avoided for years, sitting with discomfort. In the past, discomfort often triggered action, a need to fix whatever was causing the distress. If someone was upset, they fixed it, restoring harmony as quickly as possible. If tension appeared, they resolved it, smoothing over the conflict before it could escalate. If conflict emerged, they managed it, taking control of the situation. But now they start learning that not every uncomfortable feeling requires immediate intervention, that some discomfort is simply part of growth. Not every emotional reaction needs to be solved, that some feelings just need to be felt. Not every relationship needs to be rescued, that some connections are meant to end. This lesson is challenging because it requires patience, a quality that is often in short supply during times of transition. The empath must learn to tolerate uncertainty without rushing to restore old patterns, resisting the urge to go back to what is familiar. They must learn to trust that temporary discomfort is not evidence of failure, that the pain they feel is part of the process. They must learn that growth often feels uncomfortable precisely because it requires change, that the discomfort is a sign that they are moving in the right direction. Every moment spent resisting old habits strengthens new ones, building a new foundation for their life. Every boundary maintained reinforces self-respect, proving that they are worth protecting. Every difficult conversation survived builds confidence, showing them that they can handle hard things. Slowly, another process begins, the rebuilding of self-trust. For many years, the empath trusted external feedback more than internal guidance, looking to others to tell them who they were. They looked to other people's reactions to determine whether they were doing the right thing, using external validation as their compass. Approval became evidence of success, proof that they were on the right path. Disapproval became evidence of failure, a sign that they had done something wrong. But now they start turning inward, looking to themselves for guidance. They begin asking themselves different questions questions that shift their focus from others to themselves. What feels healthy? What feels honest? What aligns with my values? What protects my well-being? These questions gradually become more important than external validation, the internal compass becoming stronger than the external one. Self-trust develops one decision at a time, one boundary at a time, one moment of courage at a time, each small step building on the one before. The empath starts realizing that they can survive disappointment, that it will not destroy them. They can survive criticism, that it does not define them. They can survive misunderstandings, that they are not the end of the world. Most importantly, they can survive without constant approval, discovering that they are enough on their own. This realization creates a foundation that is stronger than anything external validation could provide, a solid ground that cannot be shaken by the opinions of others. Growth often feels lonely before it feels empowering, the loneliness a necessary part of the journey. And as self-trust grows stronger, the empath begins seeing themselves with new clarity, a vision that was previously clouded by the need for approval. The need for constant approval starts losing its power, fading into the background. Reactions that once felt overwhelming become easier to navigate, manageable rather than terrifying. Criticism no longer carries the same emotional weight, no longer a threat to their very existence. Disagreement no longer feels like rejection, but simply a difference of opinion. The empath begins understanding that their worth does not rise and fall based on how pleased other people are, that their value is inherent, not earned. This shift changes everything, transforming their entire relationship with themselves and the world. For the first time, they stop measuring themselves through the eyes of others, no longer defined by external opinions. They stop asking whether everyone approves, releasing the need for universal acceptance. They stop trying to earn acceptance through endless giving, recognizing that love should not be a transaction. They stop performing versions of themselves designed to make everyone comfortable, choosing authenticity over approval. Instead, they begin focusing on authenticity, on honesty, on alignment between their actions and their values, living a life that is true to who they are. Their intuition also becomes stronger, clearer, more reliable. For years, intuition was often drowned out by obligation, their inner voice silenced by the demands of others. The empath sensed red flags but ignored them, dismissing their instincts as overreaction. They noticed unhealthy behavior but explained it away, rationalizing the things they saw. They felt discomfort but convinced themselves they were overreacting, doubting their own perceptions. Now those instincts become easier to hear, the quiet voice growing louder. Without the constant pressure to maintain approval, they can finally pay attention to what their intuition has been telling them all along, the wisdom that was always there but could not be heard. As this awareness develops, manipulation becomes easier to recognize, the patterns of control becoming visible. Tactics that once created guilt lose much of their influence, their power diminished by clarity. Emotional pressure becomes visible, the attempts to control now obvious. Attempts to create obligation become obvious, the guilt trips and demands exposed. The empath begins seeing behavior patterns instead of getting lost in emotional reactions, observing the dynamics rather than being caught in them. This does not make them cynical, cold, or hard. It makes them discerning, able to see clearly what was always hidden. They remain compassionate, but their compassion is no longer blind, guided now by wisdom as well as heart. Another important change begins taking place, a shift in how the empath relates to their own life. The empath starts choosing peace over performance, prioritizing their own well-being over appearances. In the past, much of their energy was spent maintaining an image, the reliable one, the understanding one, the endlessly patient one, the person who could handle everything. They spent so much energy being the person everyone expected them to be that they lost touch with who they really were. But maintaining that image required constant effort, a performance that never ended. It required suppressing needs, hiding frustrations, and ignoring limits, pretending to be strong when they were falling apart. Now they begin choosing peace instead, valuing their own inner calm over the approval of others. They stop trying to prove their goodness through exhaustion, recognizing that their worth is not measured by their suffering. They stop trying to demonstrate their value through sacrifice, understanding that love does not require self-destruction. This creates a deeper sense of stability, a foundation that is not shaken by the winds of opinion. The empath no longer feels pressured to earn belonging, knowing that they deserve connection just as they are. They no longer feel responsible for maintaining every relationship, releasing the burden of holding everything together. They no longer feel obligated to carry emotional burdens that belong to other people, setting down the weight that was never theirs. Their self-respect becomes stronger because it is built on truth rather than performance, on authenticity rather than approval. And this is where the real transformation begins, the moment when everything changes. The empath reaches a point where they finally understand something that changes everything, a truth that was hidden beneath years of people-pleasing, overgiving, and emotional responsibility. A truth that was always present, waiting to be discovered, but impossible to see while trapped inside old patterns. They were never responsible for saving everyone, no matter how much they wanted to be. They were never responsible for carrying everyone's pain, no matter how much they felt it. They were never responsible for keeping every relationship alive, no matter how much they invested in them. These realizations do not arrive all at once, but gradually, through experience, through disappointment, through growth, through clarity. Each lesson removes another layer of unnecessary responsibility, peeling away the burdens that were never meant to be theirs. Each insight frees them from burdens they were never